Expanding your impact means more than reaching more customers. Ultimately, your work can serve as a platform for influencing other organizations and individuals. So I'm going to talk about 9 different points in this video, and they're not mutually exclusive, they're not steps or a checklist or anything, they're just some of the different ways to expand beyond your venture. The first one is sharing knowledge. So by this I mean sharing your own experience and what you've been testing and trying and the evidence you've been gathering as you prototype and talk to people and all that. So for example, we saw the Arvin Eye Care Centers, how once they figured out their model, they provide technical support and consultation to other hospitals in low-income countries. We saw how Hippocampus, early learning centers, and other educational ventures make their content publicly available and their curricula publicly available to rely on others to spread their work. And Hippocampus developed their curriculum based on others' publicly available content. One really important thing to remember is that this includes sharing your failures. Failure is knowledge. So document your attempts and let us know both what worked and, more importantly, what didn't work, so that others can build on what you're doing. So imagine the ripple effects if your work serves as a prototype for others to build on. The idea is that we don't want each changemaker to start from scratch. We want to work collectively and build on each other's experience. So that's the first point, sharing knowledge, including failures. The second point is very similar. It's about research and thought leadership. So when I worked with Al-Fanar, when things came up with our investees, I would work with my students or other academics to answer the questions I didn't know about, to share questions that we were asking in the organization, and make points that I wanted the sector to know. And this is what we mean by thought leadership. You can do it by having a blog section on your website, by participating in conferences, by having research collaborations with academics. And the point just is that innovation means continuous learning, and that this needs to happen inside your organization and in community of practice, and can be disseminated beyond. One example that really struck me was an organization here in the US called Echoing Green. And this is one of the organizations that supports social entrepreneurs through fellowship. And it's led by Cheryl Dorsey. And in 2020, they launched the Racial Equity Philanthropic Fund to center innovation on racial justice in 2 ways. First, by investing in leaders of color and other marginalized leaders. And second, by overtly embedding racial justice into the field of social innovation. And this is where the research and thought leadership came in. And their work is this initiative, the fund and the research, is a great example of entrepreneurship. Like, they already had this organization, they've been running for a long time, but they're innovating and starting new initiatives within Echoing Green. And it's a great example of extrapreneurship, because the goal is that they want to work with others. One of the things they did is that they joined forces with some of the other leading organizations supporting social entrepreneurs that you've also heard about in this course, like Ashoka, Skoll, and Schwab Foundations, to create a new initiative called Catalyst 2030. And that's going to be the case study for this module. So their article is about embedding racial justice in the field of social innovation, and especially in funding social change. And I've shared it in the readings. It became the top read for 2020 in the Stanford Social Innovation Review, which you may be familiar with by now. It's a leading source of information and inspiration for the social innovation community. So that's research and thought leadership. Next, I want to talk about policymaking. We've already seen lots of examples of this. We saw Albina Ruiz and Ciudad Saludable earlier in the course. They worked over 20 years, not only to help organize waste pickers into service providers, but also to help draft the national legislation that incentivizes municipalities to work with waste pickers as service providers. We also saw how the DBL fund, the Double Bottom Line Venture Capital Fund, is participating in advocacy for policies that increase competition in the US antitrust policies to foster innovation. So whatever your innovation is, whatever your offering is, you can use your organization or your work, even if it's not an organization, to participate in advocacy, to have a policy platform, and to work with others to advocate for policy changes that will tackle the root causes of the challenge you're tackling. Fourth, I want to talk about partnering with government and other sectors for direct implementation. So one example I love to talk about is BRAC, the largest NGO in the world. I've mentioned them. They're based in Bangladesh, and they created a new way of providing primary education. So first, they piloted their own primary schools, and they offered them directly through the NGO. And this allowed them to take risks that the government couldn't take, to innovate and fail and iterate more rapidly. And that was their role as social innovators. But then they integrated their innovation back into the system, and it was adopted by the education system in Bangladesh. And that allowed them to scale across the country and to reach all children. And this is like the golden standard in social entrepreneurship, where the social entrepreneurs can take the risks and experiment and iterate and fail. And then when they prove a concept, it can be adopted by the government and strengthen the system rather than be building a new parallel system. So building parallel systems is something we want to avoid, and an important way to avoid that is by partnering with the government and other sectors for direct implementation. Fifth, I want to talk about collective impact initiatives. Now you all met Adrienne in the second campus conversations in the course. And what we talked about with her is that there are many ways to take collective action with others, and that collective impact initiatives are one specific way. It's a specific structure with 5 pillars that include a common agenda, shared metrics, mutually reinforcing activities, continuous communications, and a backbone support. And it's that backbone structure which is what makes it different. It's actually someone's job to orchestrate all this. And Adrienne mentioned that you can learn more about collective impact initiatives by reading the Stanford Social Innovation Review article we shared and checking out other examples at thecollectiveimpactforum.org. Sixth, I want to expand that to talk about other collectives and partnerships for policy change and for implementation. There are so many other ways that entrepreneurs and institutions come together to form collectives and partnerships. So, for example, we saw in the funding module an example of a global collaboration of funders, remember, called Co-Impact. It's a bunch of foundations and others that came together to create a huge fund that funds partnerships, that funds multiple innovators working together. And one of the important things that these alliances and networks do is build new communities. So that's the 7th point I want to talk to you about, building new communities of knowledge and practice. Now, we've seen many examples of this. Like in the outcome metrics module, we learned about the Global Impact Investing Network, the GIN, and how they built a community of impact investors. And they later joined forces with the Impact Management Project, to expand on their collective understanding of best practices for measuring social change. Remember when we talked about that and we were saying like people need to get on the same page about how to measure outcomes? Now, the Impact Management Project began as a time-bound forum for building global consensus on how to measure outcomes. And they created a network of 15 members who coordinated their efforts to provide comprehensive standards and guidance on measuring, assessing, and reporting outcomes. These members include many of the networks we've already met, like the GIN and like B-Labs. So again, it was a network of networks. They brought together strategic partners to connect with their networks globally. Again, you've met some of these, the European Venture Philanthropy Association, the Asian Venture Philanthropy Network. And lastly, they convened a practitioner community representing many organizations, including social entrepreneurs and funders, to agree on and share norms related to impact management and outcomes management and measurement. And after 5 years in operation, as planned, the Impact Management Project's facilitation role concluded, with new initiatives in place to mainstream the resources created by this community. So there are many ways that the social innovators we've learned about in this course are coming together to build new communities of knowledge and practice. And that brings me to the 8th point I'd like to discuss. When communities come together, they can build movements that drive framework change. So I want to talk about going from communities to movements and what that looks like. And that's what the B-Lab movement is trying to do. It's framework change. They're literally trying to change capitalism and shift from the current status quo of shareholder primacy, maximizing profits for shareholders, to a new and more just equilibrium that takes into consideration all stakeholders. And their theory of change is that a different kind of economy is not only possible but necessary, and that businesses could lead the way towards a new stakeholder-driven model, working with governments and others. And they put forth a policy agenda, proposing changes to state and national laws in the U.S., requiring corporations to consider the interests of stakeholders as well as shareholders, requiring investors to consider beneficiary interests beyond the financial returns provided by individual companies, and recommending new tax laws and financial regulations designed to discourage compensation based on portfolio value that doesn't account for system effects. They also recommended steps for the government to support and protect coordinated shareholder action in pursuit of sustainability guardrails and other restrictions on corporate behavior, with the goal of preserving economic justice, environmental systems, and social institutions, and protecting the common interests of corporate shareholders and stakeholders. This requires a movement. It requires everyone to be on board. And with a coalition of 50 impact-oriented organizations, they called for the creation of a White House initiative on inclusive economic growth to address economic fallout from the COVID-19 pandemic, the widening racial wealth gap, and climate change. So these are all examples of social change makers coming together across institutions, what we've been calling extrapreneurship, not just entrepreneurship to start something new or intrapreneurship to innovate within your organization, but extrapreneurship to work across the boundaries of multiple institutions to build communities that then turn into movements. And lastly, I want to talk about creating new social innovation ecosystems around the world. So I've been a part of this in many different places, and I've seen social entrepreneurs that when they build the relationships required to research, develop, and implement their offerings, they're also building social capital. And you are too, right? Like you're building the capacity of others to innovate. And this can be channeled into building movements, into advocacy and policymaking, and into creating ecosystems that catalyze and amplify new social innovations. A lot of communities, cities, states, countries don't have an environment that fosters innovation and that supports social entrepreneurs. And in many different settings, social entrepreneurs and those who support them are working to grow the social innovation ecosystem. And that means bringing together social entrepreneurs and funders and policymakers and people who can technically support social entrepreneurs to build markets and to basically build a new sector. And similar movements are happening around the world. So anywhere you look, you can find a similar ecosystem or the seeds of one. And there are many different roles you can play in fostering a social innovation ecosystem. Okay, I'll stop here. So I'd like you to think about how will you use your social entrepreneurship journey to join forces with others.